cold breeze swept through the dimly lit room as the clock struck midnight. A single candle flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls, and in the silence, a faint whisper echoed from the darkness. The truth lies hidden beneath the old oak, and it will never be found unless you dare to seek it. But who was watching from the shadows? And why had the professor vanished without a trace? The mystery deepens, and the only way to uncover the truth is to follow the trail. If you're as intrigued as we are, hit that like button, share this mystery with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe so you can stay with us till the very end of this spine-tingling journey. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Chapter 1. The Mysterious Disappearance. It was a crisp autumn evening in London, the kind where the city's fog seemed to wrap itself in a thick, almost tangible embrace. The gas lights flickered in the distance as Dr. John Watson stepped into the familiar, comforting warmth of 221B Baker Street. Holmes was, as always, sprawled in his armchair by the fireplace, the dancing flames casting long shadows upon the walls. His fingers gently tapped on the armrest, the only sound breaking the silence, save for the occasional rustle of the papers scattered across his desk. Watson placed his hat and coat upon the stand and took a seat across from his friend. Holmes, ever the enigma, had a way of drawing you into his world without a single word, his mind always working, always seeking, yet never hurried. "You seem troubled, Watson," Holmes remarked without looking up from his cluttered desk. He was scanning through a series of letters, his brow furrowing slightly as his sharp eyes scanned the contents. His voice, soft and deliberate, always held a certain calmness that belied the intensity of his intellect. Watson exhaled slowly, trying to shake off the weight of his thoughts. "It's not me, Holmes. There's been another case, a peculiar one. You see, a professor from the University of London, one Professor Armitage, has gone missing." Holmes paused, his attention shifting entirely to Watson now. The fire crackled in the background, and a quiet tension settled into the room. "Missing, you say?" Holmes mused. "Tell me more, Watson." The good doctor leaned forward, his voice steady but with an unmistakable note of concern. "The professor was last seen several days ago at his home. His assistant, a young man named Oliver Finch, arrived to find the door ajar, the study in disarray, and no sign of the professor. The police have no leads, and no ransom note has appeared. Yet something feels off." Holmes's lips curved slightly, a quiet smile playing on his features. "There is always something off, Watson, and it is in these peculiarities that we often find the key to unraveling the mystery. Tell me more about the professor." Watson shifted in his seat, his mind still focused on the vague sense of unease that had lingered after hearing about the case. Professor Armitage was an academic of great renown, deeply involved in the study of ancient civilizations, particularly those of the Near East. Lately, he had been focused on deciphering some ancient manuscripts that reportedly contained knowledge long thought lost to history. Holmes tapped his fingers against his chin, a flicker of something akin to intrigue in his eyes. "And these manuscripts, Watson, were they perhaps the professor's obsession?" "They were," Watson replied, the words tumbling out. "The professor was always known for his fervent research, but recently he seemed to be more withdrawn. His assistant, Finch, mentioned that the professor had become obsessed with finding something hidden within those texts, but what, exactly, was never clear. Holmes rose from his chair, the creak of the floorboards breaking the stillness. He moved with a quiet urgency, collecting his coat and hat. "We shall go at once, Watson, a missing scholar, lost in the fog of his own obsession. There is more to this than meets the eye." As the two of them left Baker Street and stepped into the cold evening air, the city seemed to hold its breath, as though the very streets were aware of the mystery that was about to unfold. The fog curled around them, thickening with every step, and the distant sound of horse-drawn carriages echoed faintly in the air. The streets, usually so familiar, seemed to have transformed into something darker, as though the world itself were hiding secrets. Upon arriving at the professor's residence, Holmes did not immediately go inside. He stood at the doorstep for a moment, his keen eyes studying every inch of the surroundings, absorbing every detail. Watson, ever the one to trust his companion's instincts, remained silent, watching with a mixture of curiosity and growing apprehension. The door was slightly ajar, just as Finch had described. Holmes pushed it open with a soft creak, stepping inside. The house was eerily quiet, the faint hum of the city outside barely reaching their ears. The hallway was dimly lit, and the smell of old books and tobacco hung in the air. As they made their way to the study, Holmes's senses seemed to sharpen, each step taken with careful precision. When they reached the professor's study, Holmes paused at the threshold. The room was in disarray, papers scattered across the floor, books overturned. It looked as though there had been a struggle, but there was no sign of the professor. A small open window allowed the cool air to flow through, causing the pages of a nearby book to flutter in the breeze. Holmes knelt down, his hands running over the scattered papers, his fingers lingering on one particular document. "Interesting," he muttered, examining a letter that had been torn, the edges frayed and worn. It had been hastily discarded, and yet it seemed to hold significance. "This letter, Watson, has been written in great haste. The ink is still fresh, though it bears no name. It speaks of a vault and a key hidden within the professor's research." Watson leaned over, his curiosity piqued. "A vault? A key to what, Holmes?" Holmes stood up, a slight smile crossing his face as he regarded Watson. "I believe the professor's disappearance is not as simple as it first appeared. This is no ordinary case of a missing person. There is something more hidden here, Watson, something the professor was on the verge of uncovering." Holmes paused, his gaze narrowing, as if a sudden realization had crossed his mind. The professor didn't just vanish, Watson. He was led somewhere, and we shall follow him. As Holmes stepped away from the study, a deep sense of suspense hung in the air, like a cloud ready to burst. The evening outside seemed colder, the fog thicker. The mystery was just beginning, and Holmes knew that the path ahead would be filled with uncertainty, but also, inevitably, answers. The game was afoot, and no amount of fog or shadows would keep him from uncovering the truth. The mystery of Professor Armitage's disappearance had only just begun to unfurl, but already a sense of quiet dread settled over Watson. Something far larger was at play here, and as they left the house, a strange calmness filled him. It was as if the very night was watching, waiting. Soon, the pieces would fall into place. But for now, they could only walk forward into the unknown, with the steady, unyielding presence of Sherlock Holmes guiding them. Chapter 2. The Clue in the Study. The next morning, the sun had not yet fully risen, and a delicate mist hung in the air as Holmes and Watson made their way through the fog-covered streets of London. The city seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something to unfold, and Holmes, as always, seemed perfectly at home in the silence. His step was purposeful, his sharp mind already at work, piecing together the fragments of the mystery they were now immersed in. Upon reaching Professor Armitage's residence once more, Holmes did not rush inside. Instead, he paused for a moment, inhaling the crisp morning air, as though gathering every detail of the environment. Watson, ever the faithful companion, followed his lead, sensing that something was about to click into place. "Holmes, what is it?" Watson asked quietly, his voice breaking the stillness that enveloped them. Holmes turned to him with a smile, his expression almost serene. "It is in the details, Watson. The morning fog, the quiet streets. They are all part of the puzzle. We must be patient." With that, Holmes led the way into the house, where the air inside was heavy with the scent of old wood and leather-bound books. The eerie silence seemed to have deepened since their last visit, and the familiar feeling of unease crept over Watson once more. They entered the study. The room was as they had left it the day before, with books strewn across the floor and papers scattered about. Yet there was something different now. A sense of hidden knowledge, a sense that something had been left behind for them to uncover. Holmes stood still in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room with the intensity of a hawk. There was no rush to his movements, no frantic search for answers. Instead, his gaze was patient, methodical. "Holmes, do you think the professor left us a clue?" Watson asked, glancing around the room in search of something that might explain the strange scene. Holmes did not answer immediately. He walked over to the desk, the flickering light of the early morning casting shadows that seemed to move across the room. His fingers danced lightly across the edges of scattered papers, as though feeling for something hidden beneath the chaos. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, Holmes paused and bent down to examine a small, crumpled piece of paper, half hidden beneath a stack of books. Watson's heart quickened. Could it be? Was this the clue they had been seeking? Holmes unfolded the paper carefully, his movements deliberate, as if the paper itself were a fragile artifact. He held it up to the light, scanning its contents, his face unreadable. The paper was covered in hastily scrawled notes, some written in a trembling hand, others more deliberate. A few words jumped out at Holmes as he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "The key is within the circle of truth." "What could this mean, Watson?" Holmes murmured, his brow furrowing slightly. "The key within the circle of truth?" Watson echoed, his thoughts racing. Could this be a metaphor? A clue pointing us towards something the professor was investigating? Holmes nodded slowly, his mind already piecing together the fragments. "I believe so, Watson. The professor's obsession with ancient texts, with the idea of hidden knowledge. It seems this clue points to something beyond mere physical treasure. It's not about what is hidden. It's about what is revealed." He stood up, turning to Watson with a slight smile. "I think it's time we delve deeper into the professor's research. There is a connection, Watson, a deeper connection that we have yet to uncover." Holmes walked over to the large bookshelf at the far side of the room, his fingers brushing over the spines of the ancient texts that lined the shelves. The professor's studies were not just academic, he said thoughtfully. There's something more, something esoteric in nature, something that ties his work to an ancient belief system, perhaps. Watson followed Holmes's gaze to the shelf. The professor's collection of manuscripts was vast, collections of languages, forgotten scriptures, and ancient philosophies. But how do we know which book holds the secret, Holmes? How do we know where to look? Holmes's eyes gleamed with quiet certainty as he reached for a thick, leather-bound book that appeared slightly out of place on the shelf. A book that had been tucked away, as though it had been waiting for them to find it. He opened the cover carefully and flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the text, rapidly, searching for something, anything, that might confirm his suspicion. "There," Holmes said, pointing to a page filled with intricate symbols and markings. The text was a blend of languages, but Holmes seemed to understand it effortlessly. This is what the professor was working on. It's not just a manuscript. It's a map of forgotten places, of hidden vaults, of truths long buried beneath the surface of history. Watson's eyes widened in surprise. A map? But why would the professor keep this hidden? Why would he leave us such a cryptic clue? Holmes closed the book and turned to face Watson, his expression one of quiet resolve. "I believe the professor was not simply searching for knowledge, Watson. He was protecting it. There is something powerful in these texts, something that must not fall into the wrong hands." For a moment, the weight of Holmes's words hung in the air. The mystery had deepened, and the stakes were higher than Watson had anticipated. The professor's disappearance was no longer just about a missing person. It was about protecting something far more valuable than anyone could have imagined. "We must visit the university archives, Watson," Holmes said suddenly, his voice firm. If the professor was on the verge of discovering something of this magnitude, then we must understand exactly what he was up against. There is more to this story than we can see from here. As they left the study and stepped back into the foggy streets of London, Watson couldn't shake the feeling that they were being pulled into something much larger than a simple missing persons case. The clues were beginning to fall into place, but they raised more questions than answers. What was hidden within the professor's research? And who, or what, was trying to keep that knowledge concealed? The day felt heavier, as though the very air around them was thick with secrets waiting to be revealed. The game, it seemed, had only just begun. Chapter 3. A Glimpse into the Past. The morning after their discovery in the study, Holmes and Watson made their way to the university archives. The fog had not yet lifted from the city, and the streets of London remained muted, bathed in a soft, almost ethereal light. Holmes, as ever, seemed unaffected by the chill, his mind far more preoccupied with the case than the biting cold. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice steady and reflective. "The professor's research is more than just academic pursuit. It's connected to something far older, far more elusive. We must uncover the origins of this map and these manuscripts. We need to know what drove the professor to his obsession." Watson nodded, his thoughts swirling with questions. "Do you believe that the professor's disappearance is linked to something dangerous, Holmes? Is there a hidden threat we haven't yet discovered?" Holmes turned his sharp gaze upon his companion. "I do, Watson, and I believe it has to do with something the professor uncovered in his research, a knowledge that could pose a great danger if it fell into the wrong hands." As they entered the hallowed halls of the university, The atmosphere shifted. The musty scent of old books, the quiet hum of whispered voices, and the shadowed corridors created a sense of reverence. The archives were vast, stretching across several floors, with towering shelves filled with centuries-old manuscripts. The quiet was almost soothing, but there was an underlying tension in the air, as though the very walls were holding their breath. They were greeted by Miss Emily, the head archivist, a woman of gentle demeanor but sharp intellect. Her brow furrowed slightly as she led them through the archives, her heels clicking softly against the stone floors. She seemed to sense the weight of their presence, as though she knew something about the professor's research but was reluctant to share it. "You're here about Professor Armitage's research, aren't you?" she asked, her voice soft, yet filled with a quiet urgency. "We are," Holmes replied, his tone measured. "We believe that the professor's disappearance is linked to his work here, and that the knowledge he was uncovering may hold the key to his sudden vanishing." Miss Emily paused for a moment, glancing around, as if ensuring they were alone before she spoke again. Professor Armitage was an enigma to us all. He came to the archives often, but lately he had become more withdrawn, obsessed even. His focus was solely on a collection of ancient texts. There was one, in particular, that seemed to consume him. Holmes raised an eyebrow. And which text might that be? Miss Emily led them to a quiet corner of the archives, where a large, leather-bound tome rested on a pedestal. The book seemed to radiate an unsettling energy, as though it were not meant to be disturbed. Holmes approached it cautiously, his fingers brushing against the cover with reverence. "This," Miss Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper, "is the Codex Veritas, the Book of Truth. It is said to hold knowledge from an ancient civilization, one that predates even the earliest known empires. The professor became obsessed with it, claiming that it contained the key to unlocking secrets hidden for millennia." Holmes opened the book with great care, the pages creaking as they were disturbed for the first time in years. The text was written in a complex script, a language that was foreign to Watson, but one that Holmes seemed to understand immediately. As Holmes scanned the pages, he muttered softly to himself, piecing together the fragments of the text. "The Codex Veritas," Holmes said, his voice low, "describes a lost civilization that possessed knowledge far beyond what we know. This civilization understood secrets of the universe, astronomy, medicine, even immortality. And there are references here, Watson, to a hidden vault, one that can only be accessed by those who possess the key of truth." Watson's mind raced. A vault? Is this what the professor was after? Is this the reason he disappeared? Holmes closed the book, his expression thoughtful. "I believe so, Watson. The professor had uncovered something significant in these texts, something he may have felt compelled to protect. The vault may hold the key to some kind of powerful knowledge, one that could change everything we know." He turned to Miss Emily, who was watching them closely. "Did the professor ever mention the vault's location or the key of truth?" Miss Emily hesitated before answering, her gaze shifting uneasily. "He did, but he never shared much. Only that it was hidden beneath an ancient oak tree, somewhere outside London. He said the vault could only be opened by someone who truly understood the meaning of the Codex, someone who had the wisdom to unlock its secrets." Watson felt a shiver run down his spine. So, the professor was not only researching the Codex, but also searching for this vault? And now he's gone missing. Holmes nodded slowly. "I believe the professor's disappearance is no coincidence, Watson. He was seeking something far greater than knowledge. There are forces at play here, forces that would stop at nothing to keep this power hidden." As Holmes and Watson prepared to leave the archives, a quiet tension hung in the air, as though the very walls of the building were holding their breath, waiting for the next step in the mystery to unfold. The Codex Veritas, with its cryptic references to a hidden vault and the key of truth, seemed to hold the answers they sought, but it was clear that the path ahead was fraught with danger. Watson's thoughts were consumed with what they had uncovered. "Holmes," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "do you think the professor found the vault? Do you think he's still alive?" Holmes's eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a small, enigmatic smile. "The professor may have found the vault, Watson, but I suspect he has uncovered something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. As for whether he is still alive..." He paused, his gaze distant. "That, my dear Watson, is a question we shall soon have an answer to." The fog outside had thickened, curling around them like a shroud as they stepped out of the university archives and into the waiting carriage. The atmosphere felt charged, as if the very city was holding its breath, and for the first time, Watson couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, followed by unseen eyes, perhaps by those who knew of the vault and the power it contained. Holmes, however, remained calm, his mind already at work, piecing together the puzzle with the precision only he could manage. As the carriage rumbled through the foggy streets, Watson's thoughts were a tangle of fear and wonder. What secrets did the Codex Veritas truly contain? And who was it that sought to keep these truths buried at any cost? The game was afoot, and the road ahead was fraught with uncertainty. But one thing was clear. Whatever lay ahead, it would not be easily uncovered, and the shadows were deepening with each passing moment. Chapter 4. The Mysterious Visitor. It was a quiet evening when Holmes and Watson returned to the familiar comfort of their Baker Street lodgings, their minds weighed down by the discoveries they had made that day. The fog outside had thickened, draping the city in a blanket of muted gray, and the soft glow from the gas lamps cast long shadows across the room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its warmth a welcome contrast to the chill of the streets. Holmes had not said much during their ride back to Baker Street. His brow was furrowed, his sharp eyes distant as though he were piecing together fragments of the mystery that were still just beyond his grasp. Watson, too, felt the weight of the puzzle pressing on his mind. The Codex Veritas, the hidden vault, the key of truth, it was all beginning to take shape, but something felt unsettlingly incomplete. As Watson poured himself a glass of brandy, trying to shake off the tension, there was a soft knock at the door. Holmes, who had been seated in his chair, immediately straightened. He had been waiting for something, although Watson couldn't tell exactly what. "Come in," Holmes called, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed a hint of expectation. The door opened slowly, and a figure stepped into the room. It was Oliver Finch, the professor's assistant, his face pale and drawn with a nervous energy that seemed out of place in the otherwise calm setting. He looked as though he had been running, his breath shallow and quick. His eyes darted about the room as if expecting someone, or something, else to appear. "Mr. Finch?" Watson greeted him with mild surprise. "What brings you here at this late hour?" Finch looked as though he had not heard Watson at all. His gaze was fixed entirely on Holmes, and there was a wildness to it, as if he had come to some frantic realization and was desperate to share it. "Dr. Watson," Finch began, his voice trembling. I can't stand it any longer. I've been hearing things, strange noises, whispers in the night. And there's something in the shadows, something that's been following me." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You have come to us because you wish to explain these whispers, Mr. Finch. But I suspect that what you are truly afraid of is something far more tangible than mere sounds. Am I correct?" Finch nodded, his face turning even paler. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. It's about the professor. His disappearance wasn't just a coincidence, was it? There's something dangerous about his research. I can feel it, and I don't know what to do." Holmes stood up, his movements calm and deliberate as always. He walked toward Finch, his gaze piercing. "Tell me everything, Mr. Finch. What is it you believe the professor found? And what is it that has you so frightened?" Finch swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room, again as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before speaking again, his voice barely above a whisper. "The professor, he found something in his research, something more than just an ancient manuscript. It was a—" Finch paused, as if the word itself was too heavy to say. "It was a key that opens something buried beneath the earth. And the more he studied it, the more obsessed he became." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest, but his voice remained smooth, calm. "A key? A physical object?" "No," Finch said, shaking his head, his voice growing more urgent. "Not a physical object. It was a concept. The Codex Veritas, it describes the key of truth, but it's not something you can hold in your hand. It's a state of understanding, a way of unlocking knowledge. But the professor—" Finch's voice faltered, and he looked as though he were on the verge of tears. "He was being followed. I saw men watching him, and I heard them speaking about the vault. They were looking for it, Holmes, and they wanted the professor to find it first." Watson's eyes widened. "You mean to say there were others looking for the professor? People who were aware of his research?" "Yes," Finch replied, his hands trembling now. "I overheard them speaking. They wanted him to finish his work, to find the vault. But I don't think the professor was just trying to find it for the knowledge, for the discovery. I think he realized something more, something dangerous. And then he disappeared." There was a heavy silence that followed Finch's words. Holmes remained still, his gaze fixed on Finch, who looked utterly defeated. His hands clutched at his coat as though trying to hold himself together. "Mr. Finch," Holmes said softly, his voice steady but with a trace of something like pity. "The professor was indeed searching for something far more than just ancient knowledge. He had stumbled upon a truth that was never meant to be uncovered. But you must understand, the professor was not the first to come upon this secret." "What do you mean?" Finch asked, his voice trembling. Holmes paused, his eyes darkening slightly. "There are forces at play here that go far beyond simple curiosity, Mr. Finch. The Codex Veritas, the vault, the key of truth. They are not merely historical artifacts. They are part of something much larger. Something that, if unlocked, could change the very nature of power in this world." Finch's eyes grew wide with fear. "What are you saying, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes turned and walked to the window, staring out into the foggy night, his silhouette casting a long shadow in the dim light. The professor's disappearance was not the work of chance. There are others, men who seek the knowledge hidden within the vault. And I fear, Mr. Finch, that they will stop at nothing to find it. The weight of Holmes's words hung in the air, the tension thickening in the room. Watson felt the unease settle into his bones, his thoughts racing. The puzzle was becoming more complex by the minute, and with it, the stakes were rising. The professor had been only one piece of the greater mystery. An important piece, yes, but the true force behind his disappearance, the one pulling the strings, was something far more sinister. Finch's voice broke through the quiet. "What should we do now, Holmes? How can we stop them?" Holmes turned slowly, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes were sharp with determination. "We must continue the professor's work, Finch. We must find the vault before they do. Only then will we uncover the truth." The room fell into silence once more, and outside, the fog pressed in, thickening around the window like a veil of secrecy. The mystery of the vanishing professor had deepened, and now, with the appearance of this mysterious visitor, Holmes and Watson were faced with even more questions than before. Who were the men seeking the vault? And what was this dangerous knowledge they were so desperate to uncover? The night outside seemed to watch them, as though it knew the peril they were about to face. The game was no longer just about finding the professor. It was about finding the truth before it was lost forever. The suspense grew with each passing minute, and Holmes, as always, was the calm center of the storm, ready to face whatever darkness lay ahead. Chapter 5. The Old Oak. The next morning brought with it a strange stillness in the air, as if the city itself was waiting in anticipation. The fog from the previous night had not yet lifted, and the streets of London were shrouded in an eerie quiet. Holmes stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the mist as it swirled through the narrow alleys, his mind undoubtedly racing with the next steps in their investigation. Watson, ever observant, couldn't help but notice that Holmes seemed more intense than usual. There was a certain stillness in the detective's manner, as though something crucial had clicked into place. Yet, there was a hint of something darker in the air, a subtle sense of urgency. The mystery of Professor Armitage's disappearance had grown more complex with each passing moment, and now they had learned of the dangerous forces lurking in the shadows, watching their every move. "Holmes," Watson began softly, his voice breaking the silence. "What are we to make of all this? The Codex Veritas, the vault, the key of truth. Everything is leading us somewhere, but I fear we are heading into danger." Holmes turned from the window, his expression serene, but his eyes sharp. "Watson, we have followed the professor's trail to the edge of discovery. Now, we must follow it further. We know the vault lies beneath an ancient oak tree, somewhere outside the city. This tree is not just any tree. It is the key to everything. The professor's research, his obsession, it all points here." Watson nodded slowly, his mind racing with thoughts of the clues they had uncovered. "And you believe the professor found this oak? That's why he disappeared?" "I believe he found the oak," Holmes replied calmly. "But it is not the tree itself that concerns me. It is what lies beneath it. The vault holds knowledge, knowledge that can change everything. And there are those who will stop at nothing to claim it." With that, they set off, leaving the comfort of their familiar surroundings and stepping into the unknown. The carriage rattled along the misty roads as Holmes and Watson made their way out of London, toward the grove where the professor's research had led them. The journey felt long, the roads winding through the thick fog that clung to the earth like a secret waiting to be kept. As they neared their destination, the atmosphere grew heavier, the tension palpable. There was something about this place, something in the very air that whispered of ancient things hidden away for centuries. When they finally arrived, the grove stood before them like a forgotten relic of time. The trees towered above, their twisted branches reaching out like the fingers of some long-dead giant. The ground was soft and damp beneath their feet, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. The old oak tree stood in the center of the grove, its massive trunk gnarled and scarred by time. Its branches stretched wide, creating a canopy that blocked out the weak sunlight, casting the area in a perpetual twilight. Holmes stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the surroundings with the practiced ease of a seasoned detective. He seemed almost at peace, as though the quiet of the grove was in some way familiar to him. "Here," Holmes finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The professor's research brought him here, and now it brings us." Watson, though unnerved by the eerie quiet of the grove, followed Holmes to the base of the oak. The tree was massive, its roots thick and twisted, sprawling out in all directions. There was something about it, something ancient and powerful, that made the air feel heavier, as though the very earth beneath them was holding its breath. Holmes knelt down and began to examine the roots carefully, his fingers brushing against the rough bark as he traced the patterns of the tree. Watson stood by, watching his companion with a mixture of awe and anxiety. "Holmes, do you truly believe there is something beneath this tree? A vault, as the professor suggested?" Watson asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. "I believe so," Holmes replied, his tone steady. "The professor was not the first to stumble upon this knowledge, Watson. There are others, forces that seek the vault, and they will stop at nothing to find it. But we must not allow them to reach it first." Holmes's hands continued to explore the roots, his fingers moving with precision, as though he were reading a map etched into the earth. He seemed to be following an invisible trail, his mind working with a quiet intensity. Then, after a moment, he stopped and looked up. "There," Holmes said, pointing to a small, almost imperceptible crack in the earth, just beneath the roots of the oak. "This is it." Watson stepped forward, his heart pounding as Holmes carefully moved aside the dirt and debris. There, hidden beneath the thick roots of the tree, was a stone slab, a trapdoor of sorts, its edges worn and weathered by time. The markings on the stone were faint, almost indecipherable, but Holmes seemed to recognize them immediately. "The vault," Holmes said, his voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. "It's here, just as the professor said." With great care, Holmes pushed the slab aside, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading downward into the earth. The air that escaped from the opening was cool and damp, and the scent of age-old stone filled Watson's nostrils. It was as if they had uncovered a doorway to another world, a hidden space untouched by time. Holmes stood at the edge of the opening, his eyes gleaming with a mix of excitement and caution. "This is it, Watson, the professor's secret, and now it is ours to uncover." As they descended into the darkness, the world above seemed to vanish. The silence was absolute. the only sound the faint echo of their footsteps as they made their way down the narrow, winding staircase. The air grew cooler with each step, and Watson felt a shiver run down his spine. Finally, they reached the bottom. The chamber they entered was vast and cold, its walls lined with shelves of ancient artifacts, scrolls, and books. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, upon which rested an ornate chest. The chest was beautifully crafted, its surface engraved with intricate symbols and markings, symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly energy. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the chest as he approached it with cautious reverence. "This is it," he murmured. "This is what the professor was after. The knowledge contained within this chest is what brought him here, and it will be what sets us on the path forward." Watson, his heart still pounding, could only watch in awe as Holmes carefully opened the chest. Inside, instead of gold or jewels, there were scrolls, ancient manuscripts, their edges worn and fragile, their text written in a language that was at once foreign and familiar. Holmes's fingers brushed against one of the scrolls, and for a moment the air in the chamber seemed to hum with a quiet, almost imperceptible energy. "There is power here," Holmes said softly, his voice filled with a sense of awe. "But there is danger too. The vault holds more than just knowledge. It holds a secret, one that must never fall into the wrong hands." The chamber was silent once again, but Watson could feel the weight of the discovery settling upon him. They had uncovered the vault, just as the professor had. But what lay ahead? The knowledge contained within these scrolls was more than just history. It was a power that, if unlocked, could change everything. And now they were the keepers of this secret, standing at the threshold of something much larger than they could have ever imagined. But with this knowledge came a choice. Would they protect it, or would they risk everything to unlock the mysteries hidden within the vault? As the weight of the decision hung in the air, Watson knew one thing for certain. The game had only just begun. Chapter 6. The Vault of Secrets. The air in the underground chamber was cold, almost suffocating, as Holmes and Watson stood before the chest, their breaths visible in the dim light. The silence of the place was absolute, broken only by the faint echo of their footsteps and the quiet rustle of ancient scrolls as Holmes carefully lifted one from the chest. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the stillness, and Watson felt an odd sense of unease settle in his chest. Holmes's fingers moved delicately over the worn parchment, his eyes scanning the strange, arcane script. The words seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light, as though they held a power beyond simple language. Watson, though not a scholar of ancient texts, could sense the significance of the moment. The discovery they had just made, this vault, this hidden repository of knowledge, was far more than just a historical curiosity. It was a doorway to something ancient, something powerful. Holmes's face was unreadable, his sharp eyes narrowing as he studied the manuscript. "This is it, Watson," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "The professor was right. This is the key to everything, the knowledge the world has forgotten. The vault isn't just a place, it's a vessel of power." Watson's heart raced as he took a cautious step forward. "What do you mean, Holmes? What power?" Holmes turned his gaze to Watson, his expression grave. "This vault contains the secrets of an ancient civilization, one that understood forces beyond our comprehension, forces that, if unleashed, could change the course of history, and those who seek to control this knowledge. His voice trailed off, and Watson felt the weight of his words. They will stop at nothing to claim it. The chill in the air seemed to deepen, and the silence of the chamber grew even more oppressive. Watson's mind raced. The professor's disappearance had always seemed like an ordinary case of a missing person, albeit one with peculiarities. But now, standing in this cold, forgotten room, he realized how wrong he had been. This was no ordinary mystery. This was a matter of life and death. Holmes placed the scroll back into the chest and stood up, his eyes scanning the room with a renewed intensity. "We must leave this place at once, Watson. The vault's secret must be protected." Before Watson could respond, a sudden noise broke the silence, an echoing, faint sound of footsteps. Holmes froze, his eyes narrowing, and Watson's heart skipped a beat. He instinctively reached for his revolver, but Holmes stopped him with a calm gesture. "No need for violence just yet, Watson," Holmes murmured. "But stay alert. We're not alone." The footsteps grew louder, closer. Watson's pulse quickened as the air seemed to grow colder, the very walls of the chamber closing in around them. Holmes motioned for Watson to follow him, his movements fluid and precise as he led the way, deeper into the shadows of the vault. As they rounded a corner, they saw a figure standing at the far end of the chamber. The figure was cloaked in dark clothing, their face obscured by a hood. The presence of the stranger was suffocating, their very existence like a shadow that had been cast upon the room. "Well, well," the figure said, their voice cold and smooth. "It seems we have guests." Holmes's eyes locked onto the figure, his expression unreadable. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with suspicion. The figure took a step forward, their movements deliberate. "My name is not important," they said, their voice carrying an air of quiet menace. "What matters is that you are standing in the way of something that was never meant to be found." Watson's grip on his revolver tightened. "What do you want?" The figure tilted their head slightly, as if considering Watson's question. "I want what you have uncovered. The professor was merely the first to seek it. You," they paused, their eyes shifting to Holmes, "are simply the next in line." Holmes remained calm, his gaze unwavering. "And what is it that you think we have uncovered? This vault? These scrolls? They are nothing more than ancient relics." The figure chuckled softly, a sound devoid of warmth. "Ancient relics? You have no idea what you're dealing with, do you, Holmes?" The figure stepped closer, their presence almost overwhelming. "These scrolls hold the knowledge of a civilization that could manipulate the very fabric of reality. The vault is not just a repository of old texts. It is a key that opens the door to a power that has been hidden for centuries. And now you have it. You and anyone else who stands in your way will be eliminated." Watson's heart raced. "So you're telling us you want the vault? You want the power it holds?" "Power?" The figure's voice dropped to a whisper. "No. I seek to control it, to harness it for my own purposes, and I will not allow anyone to stand in my way." Holmes remained silent for a moment, his mind clearly working through the implications of the figure's words. Then, with a sudden, sharp motion, he stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with authority. "You will not have it. This vault, this knowledge, belongs to no one." The figure's eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment The room seemed to pulse with a strange, almost electric energy. "Then you leave me no choice, Holmes," they said, their voice turning to ice. "You have sealed your fate." Suddenly, the figure moved with lightning speed, a blur of motion as they advanced toward Holmes. Watson raised his revolver, but before he could fire, the figure stopped, holding up a hand. The air around them seemed to crackle with tension, and Watson felt a strange sensation, a coldness creeping through his veins. "I won't harm you," the figure said, their voice now eerily calm. "Not yet, at least, but I will give you a choice. Holmes, leave now, and you can walk away with your life. Stay, and I will make sure that you never leave this place." Holmes's gaze never wavered, his mind racing as he assessed the situation. "I'm afraid, my friend, that you've underestimated me," he said, his voice unwavering. With that, Holmes turned to Watson. "We must leave, Watson. Now." But before they could move, the figure let out a low, menacing laugh. "You think you can just walk away? The vault's secret has already chosen you. You cannot escape it." Holmes's eyes gleamed with a mix of determination and strategy. "The secret may choose us, but we will never allow it to control us. Now, Watson, follow me." As they made their way toward the entrance of the vault, Watson felt an overwhelming sense of urgency. The figure's words echoed in his mind. "The vault's secret has already chosen you." What did that mean? Were they simply pawns in a game far larger than they could comprehend? But even as they made their way back to the surface, a quiet resolve settled over Watson. They had uncovered the vault, but now they were up against something far darker and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. There were forces at play that would stop at nothing to control the power hidden within these walls. And now it was up to Holmes and Watson to stop them before it was too late. Chapter 7. The Hidden Enemy. As Holmes and Watson emerged from the depths of the vault, the heavy weight of what they had uncovered seemed to cling to them, like the cold air of the chamber they had just left behind. The oppressive silence of the grove surrounding the old oak tree felt different now, as though the very earth beneath their feet was aware of the dark secrets they had unearthed. Watson could feel the strange, almost invisible pull of the ancient knowledge that had been hidden away for centuries. His pulse quickened, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. Holmes, however, appeared unperturbed, his movements calm and deliberate, as he led the way toward the carriage waiting for them at the edge of the grove. His mind was clearly elsewhere, processing the implications of their discovery, but his outward composure never wavered. "Holmes," Watson began, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "Do you truly believe we've uncovered something so dangerous? The figure in the vault? It's clear they were not acting alone. This is bigger than we anticipated." Holmes paused mid-step, glancing over his shoulder with that piercing gaze Watson had come to both admire and fear. "Indeed, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice calm, but with a hint of something darker beneath the surface. "The vault is not merely a collection of ancient manuscripts or artifacts. It is a key, as I suspected. A key to a power that has remained hidden for a reason. But the real danger does not lie in what we have uncovered. It lies in those who will stop at nothing to control it." Watson's heart skipped a beat. "But why us, Holmes? Why were we chosen to find this secret? What is it about us or the professor that made us—" He paused, a sudden realization dawning on him. The target? Holmes exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting toward the thick fog that seemed to curl around the trees, cloaking them in shadows. The professor was merely a first step, Watson. His obsession with the Codex Veritas led him to uncover the vault, but it was his knowledge that brought us here. It is not just the vault's contents that have attracted attention. It is the knowledge contained within those scrolls. We were chosen because we are the ones who have the means to unlock its true power. Before Watson could respond, a rustle in the trees interrupted him. The sound was faint, but it was unmistakable. Holmes's head snapped toward the source of the noise, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the darkened grove. Watson instinctively reached for his revolver, though he knew it would do little against whatever force was lurking in the shadows. The trees seemed to shift, as if stirred by some unseen presence, and the oppressive silence returned, heavy and expectant. Holmes motioned for Watson to stay still, his fingers pressing lightly against his lips as he quietly advanced through the fog. Watson followed, his senses heightened, every step filled with the anticipation of something terrible about to happen. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the mist, tall and imposing, their features obscured by a dark cloak. The figure's presence seemed to warp the very air around them, as though the darkness itself had taken form. "Holmes," the figure said, their voice low and cold, "you have done well to come this far, but your journey ends here." Watson felt a chill run down his spine, and the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. The voice, deep like the sound of stone grinding against stone, held an unmistakable authority, one that made Watson feel like a mere spectator in some larger, more ancient game. "Who are you?" Holmes demanded, his tone sharp but controlled, his eyes never leaving the figure. "And what is it that you want?" The figure tilted their head slightly, as if considering Holmes's question. "I am but a servant of a power far greater than you can imagine, Sherlock Holmes," the figure replied, their voice carrying a quiet, ominous weight. "My purpose is simple, to ensure that the knowledge within the vault remains where it belongs, in the hands of those who truly understand it." Holmes's gaze flickered for a moment, as if he were considering his next move. "You think you can control what has been hidden for so long? You think you can control us?" The figure stepped forward, the shadows seeming to gather around them, drawing tighter and tighter. "It is not a matter of control, Holmes. It is a matter of necessity. You have come too far, and now you must choose. Leave now, and forget all that you have seen, or stay, and face the consequences." Watson felt the weight of the figure's words, and he knew that the situation had escalated beyond anything they had anticipated. Whoever this person was, they were not simply a rogue individual. They were part of something far larger, something that reached into the very heart of the mystery they had been investigating. It was as though the figure was the embodiment of an ancient force, one that had been waiting for centuries to reclaim what had been lost. Holmes, however, did not flinch. His mind was already working, calculating the next move, weighing the options. "You have underestimated us," he said, his voice steady, though there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something darker, more dangerous. "I do not fear threats from those who hide in the shadows." The figure's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, there was a hint of something almost like recognition in their gaze. "You think you can walk away from this, Holmes? You think you can simply return to your life and forget about what you've found?" The figure's voice grew colder, more threatening. "You are no longer mere detectives in this game. You are pawns, and the forces you have unleashed will stop at nothing to see that you are eliminated." Holmes remained calm, his expression unwavering. "Then let them come. If you believe that you can intimidate me into retreat, you are gravely mistaken." The figure's lips curled into a thin smile, one that held no warmth. "Very well, Holmes. You will soon learn that there are far greater forces at work here than you can comprehend. But you will not leave unscathed. No one who seeks the vault's secret will ever leave unchanged." With that, the figure turned and melted back into the fog, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. Holmes and Watson stood in silence, the weight of the encounter pressing down on them. Watson turned to Holmes, his voice a whisper. "What do we do now, Holmes? Who was that person, and what do they want with us?" Holmes exhaled slowly, his eyes distant, his mind already turning over the events that had just transpired. "They are a part of something much larger than we could have imagined, Watson. They are not acting alone. There are others, those who will stop at nothing to control the vault and its secrets. We cannot let them win." "But what does that mean for us, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice heavy with the weight of their discovery. Holmes's gaze sharpened, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something almost like resolve in his eyes. "It means we move forward. We uncover the truth, and we stop them before they can use it to destroy everything." As they walked away from the grove, the fog once again swallowed them. But this time, the world felt different, heavier, darker. The game had changed, and Holmes knew they were no longer just chasing a missing professor. They were up against something far more dangerous. And the clock was ticking. Chapter 8. The Final Confrontation. The carriage rumbled slowly through the fog-shrouded streets of London, the mist curling around the wheels like ghostly fingers reaching up from the earth. Holmes sat in silence, his brow furrowed with concentration, as the tension of the previous days weighed heavily on his mind. Watson sat opposite him, his eyes flickering over the streetlights as the shadows of the city seemed to grow longer with every passing moment. They had come so far, too far to turn back now. The vault, the secrets within the Codex Veritas, the shadowy figure in the grove. It all led here. And now, with every step they took, the danger grew more palpable, more immediate. "Holmes," Watson finally spoke, his voice carrying the same quiet urgency that had filled the air between them for days. "Do you truly believe we can stop them? These people who want to control the vault and its power?" Holmes's gaze shifted slightly, his sharp eyes still distant, as though seeing something far beyond the present moment. "I believe we have no choice, Watson. The forces we're up against are powerful, but they are not invincible. Knowledge, when wielded wisely, can counter even the darkest forces." There was a weight to Holmes's words, and Watson could sense the gravity of the situation in his companion's tone. The vault wasn't just an ancient relic. It was a battleground for control over something far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. And now, it seemed, the final pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. As the carriage drew closer to their destination, a strange stillness settled over the city. It was as if the very air held its breath, the fog pressing in against them like a thick, suffocating blanket. Holmes remained silent, his thoughts undoubtedly racing as he formulated their next move. Watson, however, felt the gnawing feeling of uncertainty begin to claw at him again. The carriage came to a stop with a soft jolt, and the door opened with a creak. They had arrived. The dim glow of distant lanterns cast flickering shadows on the cobblestone streets as they stepped out into the night, their feet crunching softly on the wet ground. Holmes led the way with quiet determination, his steps sure and measured. Watson followed closely, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver, though he knew it would be of little use against the danger they were about to face. The further they walked, the more oppressive the silence became, the darkness enveloping them like a heavy cloak. They reached the entrance of a grand yet decaying mansion, a sprawling estate hidden on the outskirts of the city, its once proud facade now weathered by years of neglect. The wrought iron gates stood open, as if expecting them. A soft, almost imperceptible sound reached Watson's ears, and he instinctively glanced around, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Holmes didn't seem to notice. He walked forward with purpose, his gaze fixed on the mansion's looming silhouette. "This is where they are, Watson," he said, his voice low but firm. "The final confrontation is here." The mansion loomed before them, its windows dark and lifeless, as though the building itself were a silent witness to the secrets buried within its walls. Watson could feel a strange unease gnawing at him. This place was more than just a mansion. It was a symbol of everything they had uncovered: the power, the danger, the relentless pursuit of knowledge that could destroy them all. They entered through the heavy wooden doors, which creaked ominously as they pushed them open. The hallway beyond was long and shadowed, the faint smell of mildew and dust hanging in the air. It was eerily quiet, save for the faint echo of their footsteps, as they moved deeper into the heart of the mansion. "Holmes, do you feel that?" Watson whispered, his voice barely audible. Holmes paused, his eyes scanning the darkened hallway, his senses heightened. "Yes, there's something here, something waiting." As they moved forward, the atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. The darkness seemed to close in around them, and Watson could hear his heartbeat in his ears, each pulse a reminder of the danger they faced. The mansion seemed to stretch endlessly, each room more foreboding than the last. They moved cautiously, their senses alert for any sound, any movement. Finally, they reached a grand staircase, its steps worn with age. Holmes ascended first, his movements fluid and quiet, as if the very act of stepping onto the stairs was part of some larger plan. Watson followed closely, his breath shallow as they neared the top. At the top of the staircase, a door stood ajar, casting a sliver of light into the otherwise dark hallway. Holmes reached for the door handle, his fingers brushing the cold metal. A faint creaking sound echoed through the room as the door slowly opened. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single flickering candle. The walls were lined with shelves, each filled with ancient tomes and strange artifacts. At the center of the room, standing before a large wooden desk, was a figure, tall, cloaked, and holding a long, ornate staff. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he recognized the figure. "You," he said softly, his voice sharp with recognition. The figure turned slowly, their face hidden beneath the hood, but their presence radiated power. "You've come far, Holmes," the figure said, their voice cold and measured. "But this is where your journey ends." Holmes stood motionless for a moment, his eyes fixed on the figure. "You are the one behind this, the one pulling the strings." The figure tilted their head slightly, a cold smile crossing their lips. "I am merely a servant, Holmes, a servant to a force far greater than you can comprehend. You've come here seeking answers, but you've only uncovered the beginning. The vault, the knowledge, it's all part of something much larger. And now, you've become part of it." Holmes's gaze never wavered. "We're not here to join your cause, if that's what you think. We're here to stop you." The figure's eyes glinted with something dark, something dangerous. "You cannot stop what is inevitable, Holmes. The knowledge you've uncovered is not something that can be controlled. It is too powerful, and it will consume you, just as it consumed the professor." Holmes took a step forward, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "You underestimate us. We will not let you control it." In that moment, everything seemed to shift. The very air in the room grew charged, crackling with energy. The figure raised their staff, and a low, almost imperceptible hum filled the room, vibrating the very walls around them. Watson's heart pounded in his chest as he instinctively reached for his revolver, but Holmes's hand shot out to stop him. "No, Watson, this is not the way." The figure's voice echoed through the room. "You cannot defeat us. The vault's secret belongs to those who understand its power, and you, Holmes, you are no different from the others who have come before you." Holmes took another step forward, his eyes never leaving the figure. "We may not understand it yet, but we will never allow it to be controlled. Not by you, not by anyone." With that, the figure's hand began to glow with an eerie, unnatural light, and the room seemed to pulse with energy. The walls began to tremble, the ground beneath them shifting as though something deep within the earth was awakening. Holmes and Watson stood firm, their resolve unbroken. The final confrontation had begun, but the outcome was far from certain. The power that they had uncovered was vast, and it would take everything they had to stop those who sought to control it. The stakes had never been higher, and the shadows seemed to grow darker with every passing moment. As the room erupted into chaos, Holmes knew that the battle was not just for their lives. It was for the very fate of the knowledge they had uncovered, and the world that would be forever changed by it. Chapter 9. The Descent into Darkness. The mansion trembled underfoot, a low, menacing hum echoing through the walls, as if the very foundations of the building were protesting their presence. The figure before them, cloaked in shadow and power, raised their staff, and the light that emanated from it cast eerie reflections on the surrounding walls. Holmes and Watson stood at the center of it all, their eyes unwavering, their minds focused, though the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily upon their shoulders. For a moment, there was only the sound of their own breath, the thick silence suffocating in its intensity. The figure's glowing hand hovered in the air, the energy swirling around them like an invisible storm. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and Watson could feel the cold creep up his spine, as though the atmosphere itself had become a living thing, pressing in on them from all sides. "Holmes," Watson murmured, his voice low but filled with a quiet urgency. "What is happening? This power, it's unlike anything I've ever felt." Holmes's gaze never left the figure, his mind clearly racing as he tried to piece together the growing mystery. "It's the knowledge," he said. his voice calm despite the mounting tension. "The vault, the Codex Veritas. It contains more than just forgotten history. This is not mere power. It's an ancient force, a force that once shaped the world." The figure before them stepped forward, the energy around them pulsing with an almost tangible force. "You think you understand, Holmes?" The voice was a low whisper, but it carried the weight of 1,000 years. "You think you can stop what has already begun? You are too late." Holmes remained silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a small, calculating smile, he spoke. "You mistake us for men who would flee in the face of fear. I've seen power like this before, and I've faced it down. This is not the end. It is only the beginning." The figure's smile twisted into something cruel. "The beginning? It's too late for that. The knowledge that lies within the vault is not meant for you. It is not meant for anyone. But it will be used, whether you stand in our way or not." Watson's pulse quickened, his hand tightening on the revolver at his side. There was something in the figure's words that struck at the heart of their fear. A cold certainty that whatever they were about to face could not be easily defeated. This was no longer just a case, no longer just a mystery to be solved. It was a battle for control over something that could reshape the world. The figure raised their staff higher, and the room seemed to darken further, as if the very light was being sucked into the staff's glowing core. The hum of the mansion grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards and the walls, a sound that seemed to reach deep into Watson's chest. For a moment, everything felt suspended in time. Then, with a sudden motion, the figure thrust their staff forward, and a blinding light exploded from it, enveloping the room in an intense, scorching heat. Watson flinched instinctively, the force of the light pushing him back. But before he could react further, Holmes was already moving, stepping between him and the light, his figure momentarily silhouetted against the brilliance. "Now, Watson!" Holmes shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We don't have time to hesitate." In that instant, everything seemed to click into place. Watson's instincts took over, his feet moved, and he ran toward the figure, his revolver drawn. But Holmes was faster, always faster. With a swift motion, Holmes lunged, grabbing the staff just as it was about to unleash another burst of energy. The figure's eyes widened in fury, but Holmes held firm, his grip tightening around the staff. There was a crackling sound, a violent clash of power, as Holmes struggled to gain control of the energy coursing through the staff. The mansion itself seemed to groan in protest, as though the very walls were alive, shaking beneath the strain of the battle. Watson reached the figure in a few swift steps, his heart pounding in his chest. With a swift motion, he aimed and fired, twice, 3 times, his shots ringing out in the silence. But the figure didn't fall. They didn't flinch. Instead, their eyes locked onto Watson's with an eerie calm, as if nothing could harm them. "Your bullets will do nothing, Watson," the figure said, their voice a low whisper. "This power cannot be destroyed. It is older than you can imagine." But Holmes wasn't listening. His focus remained entirely on the staff, and with a final, decisive push, he wrenched it from the figure's hands, tossing it to the side. The staff clattered to the ground, its glow dimming as if the energy had been drained from it. For a moment, the figure seemed to lose their composure, their eyes flickering with something akin to panic. But then, With a sudden, fluid motion, they turned and fled into the shadows of the mansion, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Holmes didn't hesitate. He turned to Watson, his expression hardening. "We must move quickly. We can't allow them to regain control. They'll be back, and we don't know what they're capable of." Watson nodded, his mind racing as he followed Holmes through the mansion, the path ahead uncertain. The mansion's oppressive atmosphere had only grown heavier, the air thick with an energy that seemed to hum through every stone and every corner. They had seen the figure's power firsthand, but what lay ahead? Were they merely stepping into the final stage of a battle that had been set into motion long before they ever arrived? Holmes moved with purpose, his steps measured and calculated as they approached the heart of the mansion. The vault's location was still unknown to them, but Holmes's instincts told him they were getting closer. They had the knowledge, the key, and now, perhaps, the final piece of the puzzle. But just as they reached the next door, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted once again. The walls seemed to pulse, and the air grew thick with a dark, oppressive energy that pressed in on them from all sides. The mansion was alive, and it was speaking to them, warning them of the dangers that lay ahead. Holmes and Watson reached the threshold of a large, ornate room, its windows covered in thick velvet curtains that blocked out any remaining light. The shadows seemed to stretch long across the floor, and the silence was overwhelming. As they stepped inside, a cold wind swept through the room, carrying with it the faintest sound of whispers, distant, barely audible, but unmistakable. Holmes's hand tightened around his revolver as he scanned the room. "Stay close, Watson," he whispered. "Something is here, something we have not yet encountered." And in the shadows, something moved, a dark figure, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. It was not the cloaked figure they had encountered before. This was something else, something older, something that had been waiting. As the figure stepped into the dim light, Watson's breath caught in his throat. There, standing before them, was an entity of shadow and power, its form shifting, its presence overwhelming. This was the true enemy. The figure spoke, its voice a low, haunting echo that seemed to reverberate in the very air around them. "You have found the vault. You have unlocked its secrets, but you will never leave. You will never escape." Holmes's eyes narrowed, and a calm determination filled his voice. "We will see about that." The final confrontation was upon them. The path forward was clear. They had come this far, but the question remained. Would they emerge from the darkness, or would they be consumed by it? The answer lay in the heart of the mansion, where the true power of the vault awaited. Chapter 10. The Final Truth. The room was silent, the air thick with tension, and the faint scent of mildew lingered in the corners of the mansion's heart. Holmes and Watson stood face to face with the shadowy figure, the one that had been pulling the strings all along, the one who had been waiting in the darkness. The final confrontation, as Holmes had predicted, had arrived. The figure before them shimmered in the dim light, its form flickering in and out of focus, like smoke in the wind. It was not entirely human, nor entirely something else. Its edges blurred, as though it was something born of both darkness and time itself, an entity that had waited for centuries for this moment. The power in the room grew palpable, almost tangible, pressing in on their chests with an unbearable weight. Watson's hand trembled slightly as he gripped the revolver, his heart racing, the uncertainty of what they were facing causing a pit of dread to form deep within his stomach. He glanced at Holmes, but the detective's face remained calm, his eyes sharp, analyzing everything in front of them. There was no sign of fear in his gaze, only focus, determination, and an unwavering resolve. "Who are you?" Holmes asked, his voice steady, yet tinged with the quiet authority that had always defined him. "What is this power you wield?" The figure's voice echoed in the room, a soft, resonant whisper that seemed to reverberate through the very fabric of reality itself. "I am not one to be named, Holmes. I am not of your world, but I have shaped it. I have shaped all of it. You and your companion are but fleeting moments in the grand scheme of time. The vault holds more than knowledge, Holmes. It holds the very essence of power. Power that can alter fate itself." Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "You speak of fate," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But fate is nothing without choice, and I choose to stop you." The figure's form twisted, as though it was made of darkness and light colliding. "You think you can stop me? You think you can undo what has been set into motion? You are merely a part of the equation. The vault's power is eternal. It cannot be controlled, only unleashed." The room seemed to pulse with energy, the very walls vibrating with the intensity of the figure's words. Watson felt his breath quicken as he stepped closer to Holmes, the air growing colder with each passing second. The whispers around them grew louder, the voices in the shadows reaching into his mind, filling it with doubts and fears. They were no longer alone. The mansion, it seemed, was alive, watching, waiting. Holmes turned to Watson, his eyes calm but filled with an urgency that couldn't be ignored. "Watson," he said quietly, "we must end this. The figure may wield this power, but we are not helpless." Watson nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. But he knew Holmes was right. They had come this far, and there was no turning back. They couldn't let the figure control the knowledge in the vault. They couldn't let it fall into the wrong hands. With a swift motion, Holmes raised his revolver and fired, the sound echoing through the room. But the figure moved too quickly, disappearing into the shadows with a flicker of movement. Holmes's bullet missed, but his resolve did not waver. "It's not about the bullet, Watson," he said, his voice cool and calculated. "It's about the mind. The mind can bend reality in ways a bullet never could." The figure's laugh filled the air, a low, haunting sound that reverberated through the walls of the mansion. "You cannot stop me. The power of the vault is far beyond your understanding, Holmes. It will shape the world. You are but pawns in a game that has already been decided." Holmes didn't flinch. His eyes remained fixed on the shifting shadows, his mind already at work, devising their next move. "The game is not over until the last piece is played," he replied, his voice low but filled with certainty. "You may think you control the board, but we still have a move left." The room around them seemed to warp, the shadows becoming thicker, the air heavier, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear. The figure's form seemed to shimmer in and out of focus, its voice becoming a dissonant hum that made Watson's head ache. The mansion itself seemed to breathe, its walls alive with the pulse of the vault's hidden power. "Do you hear it, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice strained. "The whispers, they're growing louder. The mansion itself is feeding off the power in the vault." Holmes didn't reply immediately, his eyes still locked on the shifting shadows. He could feel it too, the pull, the gnawing sensation that came with the overwhelming presence of ancient, untamed power. It was as if the mansion itself had become a conduit for the knowledge in the vault, and now it was alive. Alive with an intelligence that was beyond anything they had encountered. "They are trying to break us, Watson," Holmes said quietly, his voice calm but filled with an intensity that matched the atmosphere around them. "But we cannot let them. We have come this far. We have made it this far because we choose to resist." With a sudden movement, Holmes stepped forward, his hand outstretched toward the figure, his eyes narrowing with unyielding determination. "This ends now," he said, his voice resonating with a quiet authority. The figure hesitated for a brief moment, as though taken aback by the force of Holmes's will. Then, with a swift motion, it lunged, its form twisting in the air like smoke. The energy in the room crackled as the figure attempted to strike, but Holmes was faster. With a sharp motion, Holmes threw a small object into the air. A small, intricate device he had concealed in his coat. The device exploded in a flash of light, sending a shockwave through the room. The figure screamed, its form flickering and distorting, as though the light had broken through its very essence. The shadows recoiled, the hum in the air faltering, and for a moment, the oppressive weight in the room lifted. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating. "The vault's power cannot be controlled by force," he said quietly. "It must be understood, studied, respected. And you, my friend, have failed to grasp that." The figure's form began to dissolve, its power weakening as the light continued to pulse around them. "No, this is not the end," it whispered, its voice growing fainter. "You cannot destroy what has already been set in motion." And then, with a final, echoing scream, the figure vanished into the shadows, leaving the room in a heavy, suffocating silence. Holmes and Watson stood there for a moment, their breathing steady but their minds racing. The room was still, the whispers gone, the oppressive weight of the mansion lifting like a fog being blown away by a gust of wind. The danger had passed, for now, but the questions remained. Questions about the vault, the power it contained, and the forces that had sought to control it. Holmes turned to Watson, his expression softening, though the weight of the discovery still hung in the air. "We have won this battle, Watson, but the war is far from over. The knowledge within the vault will shape the future, but it is up to us to ensure it does not fall into the wrong hands." Watson nodded, his thoughts racing as he took in the full scope of what they had just experienced. The mystery was solved, but the truth was far from clear. What had they really uncovered? And what consequences would their actions have on the world beyond the walls of the mansion? As they walked away from the chamber, the faintest hint of dawn began to break through the windows. The first light of a new day, perhaps the beginning of a new chapter. But the shadows were not gone. They never truly left. The final truth, it seemed, was still waiting to be uncovered.